So we have the prime spot right after lunch, but even though I was an instructor at the Air Force Academy, I will not call anybody out for droopy eyes. I want to say thank you to Sandra, because she has been herding us cats since March timeframe. And I am Susan Sorensen. I am the chief analyst at the test division for Space Training and Readiness Command. I'm kind of like the chief analyst for consumer reports of the Space Force. And I want to give the panel members a chance to introduce themselves. I know there were bios of them, so I want them to say whatever wasn't in their bio so that you guys know the angles that we're all coming from. We'll start with you.
Good afternoon. Rich Schertzer. Narrowly, I represent a small team of mod and sim practitioners at Space Operations Command at Peterson Space Force Base. And I'm a contractor. I work for LinQuest Corporation. And more broadly, I'll do my best to speak also for the equities of Space Operations Command, or SPOC.
I'm Brian McBee, and I am the portfolio lead for Model-Based Systems Engineering and Analysis at AFRL Space Vehicles Directorate. My main role is to help understand through Model-Based Systems Engineering and Analysis what capability gaps are out there that can only be solved by new science and technology, and then being able to transition that as fast as we can.
Good afternoon. So I'm Sean Mitchum. I'm an Army major. I'm an ORSA by trade, so I'm not strictly a space professional. So Ops Research Systems Analyst, 49 Alpha in the Army, 15 Alpha in the Air Force, and then 1515 as a civilian. For the last 2.5 years or so, I've been at Space Command in J8 in the Advanced Analytics Division. And so for the last 2.5 years, we've stood up basically from nothing to IOC last summer, the Mod and Sim lab and capability, which provides the infrastructure for the entire command to use as a shared resource to conduct Mod and Sim in support of the commander's priorities. Within our niche in the J8, we focus primarily on capability, gap assessments, requirements development, that kind of thing. But we also support wargaming exercises, current operations, everything else through the CAVE. That is the name of the Mod and Sim lab that we have, so glad to be here.
Good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Scott Peoples in the Space Force. So I'm the material leader for digital test and training for operational test and training infrastructure for the Space Force. What that means is that in your traditional LVC construct, focus primarily on the V and the C, right, the virtual constructive parts, and getting our Guardians ready to experience realistic threats across mission areas that they do, which is a different way from how we traditionally trained in Space Force. It's been very exciting. We stood up a year ago, and we're growing rapidly, and I'm really excited to be a part of the team.
All right, we will kick it off with our first question, and we'll start with you, Rich, and then go down the line if you guys have anything to add. So it's a good one. What are your biggest pet peeve misconceptions that people have about space modeling and simulation?
I think from our SPOC foxhole, I know one challenge we're consistently presented with is classification. We do most of our mod and sim processing up to the TSSCI level, and largely that's because we've consistently had a Canadian flag officer in our chain of command. But it can be frustrating when you undertake an effort, you work for weeks or months, and then only to have it, either you can't share it or you weren't privy to some SAPSAR capability that was the secret sauce that then calls into question, right, all of the analytical work that you just did. So I think that's a challenge that we frequently kind of irks us.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that bothers me sometimes, I think, is especially when we're talking about doing integrated warfighting, across the whole OSD and so forth. a lot of people don't really understand timescales for doing anything in space. And so in planning for that and so forth, it's, a lot of times if we're talking about going clear out into geo orbit, that it's going to take some time to set up whatever effect or whatever we're trying to do.
So I'd say it's maybe a cultural difference. So coming from the Army, if we see a 3-foot wall, we just kind of want to break through it or find a way over it or whatever. But I've noticed in the space community, maybe there's a little more bureaucracy involved than I would prefer. And there's reasons for that. They're all good reasons. Part of that is the classification issues that we have. Things are very high level in the space community, which kind of limits, at the most basic level, the number of people who can look at a problem for you. And if you're limiting the people who can address your problems, then you're limiting the number of solutions you're going to get, and you might not get outside the box thinking. So if we open that up, flatten the playing field a little bit better, we might get some better answers.
Yeah, I think I'll echo the call for thinking differently about classification, right? It's a huge challenge that we run into within operational test and training infrastructure. Particularly, what we are trying to do is leverage a variety of frameworks and environments from other joint partners, right? Because we know that test and training has been done in a lot of different forums and at a lot of different classification levels, but rarely at perhaps like the TS and SCI and SAP level, right? And if you are charged, like we are, with providing test and training and capabilities to all Guardians, then you inherently have to build an environment that is capable of reaching all of those. And so getting that together has been a big challenge because that's not typically how the other services fight. And so that is one area where as a service we've kind of had to strike out on our own and try to develop some of those capabilities.
All right, now I'm going to start with you, Colonel Peoples. So it's a two-part question. Is there a need, I'm guessing the answer is yes, but is there a need for Guardians to test and train in an integrated live virtual constructive environment? And when you answer yes, what are the key M&S challenges associated within that robust environment for use by the test and training squadrons? I guess it says.
Yeah, so yes, an inherently one-part question, right? Yes, we do want to test and train together in an integrated LVC environment, which is really exciting to be here and see all the capabilities that are on the floor and what industry and academia has to bring to bear. So this is a fantastic forum for us. I think the big challenge that we run into, or one of the key capabilities that we want to do, is that you can't do everything on orbit that you want to train to do for the Space Force. We mentioned, just right ago, classification issues, but there's even more issues in that. One of the issues that I don't think a lot of people outside the service are witting is that there is a culture of test and training in the other services where specific platforms, right? There are orange tail F-16s dedicated to test and training mission sets. The space community, AFSpace prior and now the Space Force, for our legacy platforms has never purchased dedicated additional test and training devices, right? Or systems, right? There is not a training SBIRS up on orbit. And so inherently that drives us as a service to a more digital test and training posture because you're not going to get those reps and sets on orbit as much as you're going to take a jet off the runway and fly it, right? So that has been one of the challenges. Inherent in that is, while there's a increased focus then on the digital environment, the legacy digital environments that were developed were stovepiped to their systems and were not made to integrate together or talk together. And so as we became the Space Force, due to the increased threats on orbit and the need to provide cross-mission area effects for Guardians to train together in support of those mission threads and those kill chains, the legacy systems aren't able to connect in the way that we need them to. So I think that that's the key challenge that we're facing. What we're doing to do that is, to try and address that, is define the infrastructure, and by that I mean ICDs and standards for synthetic environments that will help industry know what they need to integrate into so that industry can show up with these great ideas and play, much like the Air Force has JSE or DMON, right? The Space Force needs equivalent distributed training and higher-end digital test capabilities analogous to those that will allow industry to know what they need to build to. And that's what my team is focusing on in the short term.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Or I can move to your next question.
I can just point out the obvious in that like digital training is critical for the space domain. So if you throw a track on a tank, you can bring it into the motor pool and fix it. But if you're having issues on orbit, then you're not going to be able to just fix it. There's also a cost to all kinds of training. Guardian can't necessarily move a satellite on orbit without expending some kind of delta V, or there's some kind of cost there. So everything they do is inherently digital and virtual, whereas you can't get out there and touch what you're working with. So it's really their only option for the space community.
If there's nothing else to add, I will double tap you, Major Mitchum, and ask you, coming from the Space Force analytic community, what are we doing right now, and how can we double down on those to increase the successes?
And that's good. I don't want to harp on like all the bad things everybody's doing, right? So let's focus on some wins. I'll start off by saying there's a huge appetite, especially in the leadership at the GOFO SES level, for robust analytics. And they're really, the more you give them, the more they want. And every time we brief either General Whiting at the 4-star level or the J director at the SES-1 level, or SES-2, excuse me, they always say, this is great, go out, do more. What do you need support with? How can we help you? And they help us make those connections. And when you have that kind of emphasis from the top down, you really get support and collaboration at the lower levels, which helps significantly. And we try to overcome those 3-foot walls I was talking about because we have that kind of top cover and support. The other thing that does is it allows us to present capabilities and requirements to the Pentagon, like Joint Staff, CAPE, those kinds of entities, Congress, with robust analytics behind them, saying this is what we want, but this is also why we want it. We've run the analysis, we've run the models and the simulations to determine why this is a critical gap and what's going to happen if we don't fill this gap. What's the risk to the mission and to the force? And since we're all kind of synced together on the importance of MONSIM and analysis, we don't really get too much pushback. The other third kind of topic I'd discuss on the space front is that the Space Force itself is inherently joint, both in historically, if you ask any Guardian today what they were doing 5 years ago, I promise you they're not going to say I was a Guardian because it didn't exist. So each one of these Guardians has been something else before. So they're bringing that wealth of knowledge from the other service, other organization, either could be a school, could be a government entity, or whatever. And they're bringing that to the Space Force as just part of the culture. And it's inherently built in. And that helps you as we transition towards a warfighter mindset, as you're bringing these warfighters into the organization who can kind of give you a change of perspective.
Yeah, and you know, in terms of manpower, one thing I think that we need a lot more of, and I hope people that are here from the Pentagon are listening, is we need a lot more government ops researchers who can do the due diligence that needs to be done to be doing all this analysis. We can write all these great simulation environments and so forth, but there is a true art to the ORSA discipline, and we need to have more than enough of them in this time where we're looking at GPC and where we're trying to understand how we're going to do warfighting, not in OODA loops, but like OODA hyperspheres. And this is something that we need to we need to really get after that in terms of manpower.
100% I agree, as an ORSA myself. So on that, Dr. McBee, I wanted to ask you, how can we best use M&S to help us best understand the near, mid, and far-term capability gaps that we have that can only be addressed with research and development?
So near term, I think tends to be a little bit easier. Everyone's heard of Fight Tonight, and a lot of analysis has been going on those lines. But getting into near-term future, far-term future, some of those, that gets more complicated. I think that there needs to be a lot more. We talk about GPC and we think about potential adversaries. we need a lot more people reading their journal articles to understand where they're going, and there's a lot of like surrogate things for warfighting operations that you can kind of detect that, oh wait, you know, this RPO capability could cause a lot of damage to different things, and you kind of read it in between the lines and see what people are doing. I think that will help a lot. I also think that we need to plus up our intelligence centers towards also working this kind of analysis with people who are also kind of like, at least people on the blue side of the house, and their expertise on where they see technology is going and how it potentially will impact future warfare. And be able to use that as well to just kind of predictively do it based off of what potential adversaries seem to be moving toward. And I think that we can do that. But you know, this is another thing that needs more resources. And yeah, the funny thing is about modeling and sim in general is it's generally under-resourced. I think everybody probably suffers with that. And that's something that I think that we need to get plussed up so that we can address these things.
Does anyone have anything to add?
I would echo the call for a focus on not only mod and sim. I think that when we talk about resourcing for test and training. Mod and sim is a key part of that. But I think it is a broader discussion on a service. You know, the CSO has put out his C notes that have calls for increasing the training and readiness of our Guardians, right? SPA 4-Gen cycle is all focused on that. And so to be able to train Guardians to that level and have them ready within their dwell cycles as they need to be presented, that requires a constant increase in the level of support for training functions, be that mod and sim or be that other training infrastructure, to be able to run those mission sets effectively.
Dr. Schertzer, how can we best use M&S to employ, to the greatest effort, the systems and forces the Space Force has today?
So, yeah, as Brian said, the fight tonight, so Spock largely cleaved from AF space. As part of the Air Force, was looking more future epic, and now is the domain of that fight tonight. Basically answerable to newly stood up components that support the warfighters. And so the other services have decades of experience with this. It's all new to the Space Force, but we've got components supporting Central Command, European Command, Indo-PACOM, et cetera. And so where we're positioning ourselves is as they draft and produce validated support plans to those warfighters, whether that's United States Space Command or a terrestrial command, we're trying to evaluate, basically, is the service ready? You know, how do we see these plans playing out? Do we assess any risks or opportunities? And then the flip side of that is the subordinate units to Spock, all of the space deltas and the tactical units that are providing these effects or the space-based capabilities, turning around and then also trying to help apply mod and sim to help them inform their operating concepts, how they intend to employ these space and counter space systems and capabilities, and also as they develop TTPs. So a lot of that's still in flux as a relatively new service and a new command, but that's where the main focus of our efforts is.
Excuse me. So next, I want to pivot back to Dr. McBee and talk about how to best model the human decision-making in the tactical, operational, and campaign warfare.
Yeah, this is an interesting problem that I think dogs all of us a little bit. Is okay. ultimately, we're getting more and more human on the loop, but there's still a human on that loop somewhere in there that's there. And so there's going to be pucker factor. There's going to be psychological operation type stuff going on against these folks, cyber attacks, things like that. And how do they handle that stress and so forth? There's some interesting theory that's been researched at Sandia National Labs, where they're looking into an economic theory called prospect theory, where it's pretty much about people's perceptions of gains and losses, and you have to get really good at interpreting what they see as gains and what they see as losses. And there's mathematical ways to actually represent some of this stressed human decision making. I also need to plug Human Effectiveness Directorate at AFRL, who also they actually will do live virtual constructive activities and take note of decisions that are made and so forth, and kind of learn from that. And there's this notion of understanding, something like an apprentice, a journeyman, and an expert at various career fields, and being able to actually stochastically play that out. So some of that stuff is going on, but it's not, at least I don't feel like it is propagating throughout the general analytic community. But I certainly endorse all of those activities.
So I'd say on our end, we've done some work into what are the most important factors in space on-orbit confrontations, right? And the thing that we've kind of found is that the time to decision, the squeezing down that OODA loop or that kill chain is the single most important thing you can do. And the way you accelerate that is kind of give these assets a little more autonomy to make decisions. So it's not necessarily the human in the loop, it's kind of the loop. So if it takes time for an asset to observe and then report, and then that report gets jumped across 4 different systems where 3 of them are getting hand jammed between them, and then you have that reported to a person who is sleeping, and then that person makes a decision. It's not necessarily the decision time that's important. It's all those links in the chain that come back. So we've trained our warfighters to be decisive. That's great. But finding the links in the chain and the gaps between the links that really slow down the decision process to make decisions on orbit and then react to an aggressive action is really where we got to focus a lot of our efforts.
So I think you're picking up on a thread that I think is really important here, which is what I would call like the bridge between pure mod and sim and an operational training construct, right? So how do you find out all of those hops in between, when a object makes a decision or needs to pass data back, is that you have a robust training infrastructure that is able to model accurately those and have an operator there at a training simulator that can actually react to that stimulus on the timelines that are relevant for the actual on-orbit operation. And that's how we get better as a warfighting culture.
Anything to add, Rick? Back to you, Colonel Peoples. So if you take into consideration how we've gotten to where we are today with the tests, training, and skills, and how different the future looks, what kinds of novel M&S technology do you see as needed to help prepare our Guardians?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a really fantastic question, and I think it really speaks to, again, walking the floor and seeing some of the great innovation from our industry and academia partners, and seeing, some of these technologies that we think we could apply in the realm of space test and training, especially in the digital side. What I think back to is, again, if you go back to the Chief of Space Operations C notes, and you go into what we're doing here, right? We are trying to field combat-ready forces to enable competitive endurance, right? That force posture is the most important thing. What we have to do to get there is arrange capability and representative training devices that allow our Guardians to train against thinking adversaries, experience relevant and realistic threats within a representative domain, right? So when I walk around and I think about that, that sort of that charge that we have, the one technology that leaps out to me is artificial intelligence, right? Machine learning specifically, And when you look at specific applications of artificial intelligence to threats, you think of techniques like reinforcement learning or similar techniques, right? But we have world-class space aggressors at the 57th and the 527th Space Aggressor Squadron, right? Thumper and Happy do amazing jobs out there. But if we're going to scale Guardian training to where it needs to be, to where I can have every Guardian train against threats and scenarios, I do not have enough aggressors in the Space Force to have them sit at a console and pilot a threat against each one of my Guardians every time a Guardian needs to train. And so we, in digital test and training, are looking at what AI techniques can we leverage and what companies have the kind of technologies to be able to initially pilot those threats, right, to augment our aggressor forces, to help be stand-in aggressors or paired with aggressors to increase the size of the threat coming at you. And on the flip side, obviously, you can see where that kind of technology naturally leads itself as well as applications to a Blue Force, right? So I, as a Guardian, can I operate a satellite and have a wingman, right? That is optionally a person or optionally an AI, right? So that kind of is the ideal state that we want to get to for digital test and training, is one where Guardians have access to on-demand training that incorporates relevant and realistic threats, whether or not I can have humans actually next to them to be in that cross-mission scenario with them, right? A colleague of mine, Jess Mahoney, says that this is like fighting bots in Fortnite, but I can't personally verify if that's true or not.
Dr. McBee, do you have anything to amplify? Not to put you on the spot. I just thought, because you were talking, because this had to do with the novel M&S technology
Right.
for training and preparing our Guardians.
Yeah, and I guess I go back to the same thing. I just think that there are, we should be recording the reactions that the humans in the loop make, and we then kind of, and then there are statistical techniques to represent those decisions.
All right, we're going to pivot a little bit, and this is directed at Major Mitchum, but I'd like everybody to chime in if they have something to add. So you already talked about the successes that the analytic community is having, specifically in space. But now could you just talk a little bit about the challenges, which hopefully they're not as long as the successes, but if they are, that keep us from being able to integrate and collaborate, in addition to the obvious one with compartmentalization that we all touched on because it's a challenge.
Yeah, so I'll start at the macro level. So space as an environment has never really been contested. So we need to focus as a community to make the mindset shift that we are now in a contested environment. We can't just work with space superiority and take it for granted. And that's been true for the Air Force and whatever element of the Space Force you want to talk about for the last 20 or 30 years. You could work with impunity. No one was trying to actively aggress against your forces. So we don't have the luxury of time so much anymore in this contested environment. So when the balloon goes up, we have what we have, and we need to be able to communicate and collaborate in order to use the kit that we have that's currently available to us. And then the second part of that mindset is understanding the impact to the warfighter. It's not space for space sake anymore. There is a direct impact to every single warfighter on the ground because they use space in every action that they take. And if their GPS doesn't work or their SATCOM doesn't work or something like that, then they're at a disadvantage. And there's serious risk to the forces in that situation. So as a community, if we could just harp on that a little harder, that this isn't just fun anymore, we need to buckle down and support each other to get the mission completed in order to support those people on the ground, I think we'll make a lot of progress. A little more on the macro level for analytics, or micro, excuse me. I think we have a data problem. We don't necessarily have a mod and sim problem. Like, we have tools available. We know how the physics work. We have trained analysts who can build a model for you. Problem that we're running into is, where does the data come from? Is it authoritative? And what if you have two authoritative sources that disagree with each other? What if what if I'm building a model at Space Command that uses a different format than what they're using at SWAC, and we can't talk to each other, and then we come up with different results, and we go to the joint staff, and we have conflicting priorities. And all that boils down to what we started with, which was the data in the first place. Some of the challenges we run into is that where that data is stored and what different classification levels it is. It's not only just NIPR, SIPR, JWICs, but each organization has their own NIPR, SIPR, and JWICs, right? Which makes it even more challenging. It just compounds the problem. Yeah, so that's a start. I know there's a lot of people working on the data problem, but I want to highlight it.
Yeah, I guess my point on that is I think, all models are false, some are useful. I think everyone knows that phrase. And I think that even though they're all false, we can try to be mutually consistent. And I think that that's a lot about communication across organizations and being willing to take the time to do that. And then also communication across the industrial workforce as well that is helping us build this infrastructure so that we can really get to standards that maybe they're not the best, but they're good enough, and so that we can actually get at this.
And I think I'd echo Major Mitchum's sentiment in always chasing authoritative sources. That's something we could certainly do better. On the tool side, I guess I'd also add one ModNSim tool that we employ at SPOC is the campaign level of modeling. The government-developed tool Storm may get some disagreement in the broader audience, but there's some level of commonality across the services in adopting that in certain degrees. But it's been highlighted that in the domains of space and counterspace and also cyber that there are certainly improvements that can be made at that level of abstract modeling and getting at the measures of outcome and the so what and what difference does any of this make to the warfighter. And I know efforts are underway to make improvements in the tools at that level, but we're certainly years away from seeing that come to fruition.
Yeah, I'd double down on that the campaign level tools that we have available to us are just lacking in the space layer. And we know that it's at all the levels. AWG is putting together the next version of Storm to include more space stuff. We're getting the emphasis, and the problem is recognized, but we need more robust space modeling capabilities at the campaign level.
What I wanted to highlight about that is I think one of the challenges that we face as a Space Force, this may be just as a training community, right, is sometimes we have some imprecision of terms, right? And so we talk about models and we talk about training, and you come to find out that when you usually dig below the surface on what somebody means on that, there's a whole spectrum inclusive in there, right? Am I talking about training like learning about what space is, or am I talking about training about what keystrokes on my AEHF console are going to allow me to do a maneuver? And I think that I have a lot of great industry partners that we talk to a lot, but I think that I feel like I have a lot of industry partners who think that my challenge is visualizing the space environment. It is not. It is very easy to see space, right? Anybody can gin up some satellites in Unity and show me that, right? My challenge is replicating operator interfaces in a realistic way with actual operator inputs and the stimulus that they're going to feel as an operator sitting at their console when they are in combat, right? And so I think that, understanding that when I am saying training, sometimes I think the focus goes to, well, people just need to learn about space. Well, really, I really need people to know how to fly these various satellites in the face of a contested and degraded environment.
And then I'm going to double down here on this question to keep you going. So how can we leverage the current M&S advances so that we can strengthen the Space Force digital infrastructure for training, loaded word, in a single synthetic environment for incorporating ground and space-based capabilities?
Yeah, so, the ultimate goal here, right, is our Guardians have to be able to develop and prove out TTPs in whatever system they are doing, right? For whatever system they are doing across mission threads and kill chains. And I think that this is one of the great successes of putting together the Space Force, is getting less of a focus on your siloed capability and more of a focus on what are we bringing to the fight in terms of a mission threat or a kill chain, right? And that is inherently cross-domain. It's across multiple domains. It's not just space and ground, right? There's air aspects, there's maritime aspects in there. I think it's a bit of a misnomer to focus on saying that we need one synthetic environment that's going to incorporate all aspects of something, right? There's going to be a large variety of synthetic environments, I think. We're going to try and focus on a couple, right, initially, but these environments are fit for the purpose of which they have. We've identified two broad use cases, one being mainly distributed for the purposes of training at a lower fidelity level that also supports joint exercises, right? And then another one that is high fidelity, that is used for TTP validation, operational test points, right? Again, I'm going to say analogous to the Air Force and the Navy with JSE and DMON or NCTE, right? Two separate synthetic environments, both built for purpose, both serving the needs of their training audiences for what they are doing at the time, right? So I don't think that pursuing one synthetic environment holy grail solution is the answer, and we are pursuing a dual path approach. And I think that the way that we leverage advances, and what we're going to do as the Space Force, again, given the Space Force is small, right? I think people have heard General Gutlein say this multiple times. We have to partner to win, right? And so the way that we are going to leverage advances in modeling and simulation is, honestly, we're going to partner with our joint partners and leverage existing modeling and simulation frameworks and build on top of them. Because otherwise, yet another tool that is unique to the Space Force, I don't think is going to get us the training outcomes that we need to be effective in the joint fight when it comes.
Does anyone have anything to add? It does lead nicely into your next question, Major Mitchum, which is this panel is composed chiefly of Space Force, prior Air Force, and Space Command personnel. So what are our organizations doing to collaborate and coordinate model development across the Joint Force so that we can reduce duplication of effort and produce these validated models that are then shared across the community because resources and...
Yeah, so as the COCOM rep, I'd like to kind of foot stomp the services versus COCOM delineation, right? We have different priorities, different missions. What I've noticed working with the other COCOMs is that there is a lot of analytics going on at the combatant command level. We've been to a lot of these DAF and TSA events, and we'd find that the same 5 or 6 people from 5 or 6 different COCOMs would keep showing up. And so we'd all get together and hang out and talk, and we had a lot of the same problems. And we were like, how do we solidify a process that helps us better collaborate at the joint level? So we stood up this combatant command analytic community of interest. It's been about a year now. We meet quarterly, once a year in person. And it's strictly just the COCOM analytic organizations, usually at the AO level, discussing what they're working on. Kind of the first thing we were able to suss out of that was how are we organized at the command level doing analytics? And we saw there was a wide range, that no COCOM exactly mirrors another COCOM. I mean, there's 11 of us, there's 11 different ways to solve this problem. And it goes all the way from outsourcing everything to insourcing everything. So that was an interesting takeaway, and we're learning from each other. So I mentioned that we're building a modern sim lab at Space Command, and we're able to take those blueprints that we developed and the lessons learned, and we've given them the NORTHCOM, we've given them the SOCOM, and they're kind of standing up their own thing. I just gave up my best analyst to CENTCOM, and he went over there to be a branch chief. And so we're just trying to work closer together at the COCOM level to provide analytics that are in sync with each other and that work together at the basic level so that maybe someday when we bring our IPL issues forward to Congress, et cetera, that they have, say, my number 2 lines up with SOCOM's number 4. And we're able to massage that language so that Congress sees it and they're able to support our requirements. So at the COCOM level, like, we're pretty well synced. We're getting better at it. So as you look across the space community, there's probably a lot more we could do. I will say, at least we speak the same language in the space community, so our problems are a lot more aligned. Whereas across the COCOM, you're going to see it a little more linear. And maybe the other panel members can talk about how they're all working together, but I don't want to harp on it too bad.
So we are internally within AFRL Space Vehicles Directorate. We have a couple of different things that we're doing. One is we are the ones that are sort of coordinating on priorities for how to represent space in AFSIM. And if anyone wants to look me up later on, feel free. We can get you in on some of these big Teams meetings that we have to really get after prioritizing what we need to. The other thing is some of our other modeling and sim software development. We've already been sharing with the NSTT side of things, and so we have some pretty cool things that we've also been sharing with the Space Flag folks as well. So we're sort of doing some, not particularly R&D, but just how can we set up better training environments for the future. And so we're working on some of that from the space side. And we certainly would like to be working with some of our other AFRL folks that specialize in this type of thing as well. The last one is really just our scientific expertise. We have a lot within AFRL, and so we can provide a lot of SME information to people who maybe don't have the depth that they need to do various aspects of space operations.
To piggyback on that, how can we best model and synchronize the red and the blue models within that?
Well, so I think for me, one of the biggest things I glommed onto about maybe 4 or 5 years ago is this thing that's become sort of a buzzword nowadays, in at least in systems engineering, of SysML. My feel is that is an excellent tool for being able to represent how we're going to create a simulation, represent systems of systems, and how parameters are passed, and all of the different aspects that go into potentially joint warfighting. There's scalability issues there, and there's research and development being done to work on those. But I do feel with where we're going in HPCs and so forth, that we might be able to actually do campaign modeling at a entity level. And I think that could be a huge thing for all of us.
Yeah, I kind of harp on that, getting back to the data side. How do we make sure our blue and red order battles are correct? So there is an effort by SSC, it's called the Blue Analytic Baseline, and that's what Space Command's trying to support. It's built in Warp Core, there's a SysML backbone to it, and that's where we're relying on that analytic baseline to be the starting point for our models. And as we move forward, hopefully, like, more organizations within the space community will tie into that.
Yeah, I guess I'll get to the main point of that question. So at least right now, NASIC and NSIC are both working very hard on both. So that's something that we're absolutely looking forward to as they progress with that. They've already been producing models. They've joined in the AFSIM game for doing mission level modeling, and so they're actually doing mission level scenarios that we can plug into and do studies on. And they're having that be SysML based to sort of architect what that simulation is going to look like. So it's happening that far. I would love to see it spread out to ONI and NGIC and whichever, the DIA one. But all of those, I think if we could get to that point where we're, especially on the acquisition side, defining the systems of systems, that we're doing that in SysML and we're doing it adequately, that we're representing the threat system with whatever variability there might be, because everything is uncertain with intelligence. But then on the blue side, where we can actually get fairly specific.
So to jump in on that, right? So what are we doing, right, to pull in your thread from an acquisition side to enable this kind of thing? I think what you're hearing from multiple people up here on the panel is that the synchronization only occurred when there was underlying agreement about the format or the framework, right, that we were going to use. Again, to my earlier point of so many people say models without specificity as to what framework you're using or how you're coding them or what sort of language you're using, it can mean a lot of different things. On the OTTI side, what we were trying to do is we just got a signed requirements document from General Sheba for an interim requirements document for digital ranges. And what that means is, as we take that and decompose it, we intend to produce ICDs and standards for communications and models that will operate within the digital ranges as operated by STARCOM for the purposes of the large force employment training, right? Now, obviously, we're going to leverage the great work that's been done by other players as we build out those standards and frameworks. But the way that you start to chip away at this problem is from an acquisitions perspective. You levy requirements on new acquisitions programs that they must be compatible with the OTTI digital ranges as part of their contract with their primes, right? And so I think that as you see us from OTTI, again, very young organization, but as we build out those specs and standards, I think you'll see those start to get proliferated on new acquisitions as they start coming out of the acquisitions arm of the service.
And I'd add too, Brian mentioned the intelligence community efforts for standardizing red representations, and we certainly applaud that as well. And not to sound like the fly in the ointment, but I think in addition to the challenges then with getting some commonality with blue, it also ties back to oftentimes classification hurdles, but also so much that we're trying to get after is what do the commercial actors bring to bear on the space fight and partner nations, and then that gets even a little murkier. It's tougher sometimes to get to something that you'd call correct or even reasonable. So that's certainly an ongoing challenge.
That's the end of our pre-questions. So now I have questions from the audience. And I'm just going to throw them out there. So the first question was, can you provide a definition of space warfare and explain how M&S fits into this construct? And I guess I could start with you, Dr. Schertzer, because you work at Spock.
Space warfare?
Yes. Is that a thing?
Sure. I think like Major Mitchum said, I think it's certainly expected to be a thing. And I know that this is a broad generality, but in the way we see our components, our kind of sister field commands and components as they draft up their plans on how they're going to support Space Command and the other combatant commands, is generally speaking the space and counter space capabilities that are provided to support a prospective fight in space will likely be presented to U.S. Space Command. Those that are physically in a theater, so an unclassified example is like SATCOM jammers that might be peppered throughout an AOR. Those are likely to be actually presented to that geographic, like Joint Task Force type commander. So I think, I don't know if that helps, but certainly counter space effects might be brought to bear from the Earth to space, or it might be in space against space. Maybe leave it at that if anybody wants to jump on that.
I guess one of the main points I would make is that I think people don't realize how much strategic stuff there is in space. And a lot of these are fat, juicy targets They need to be defended. They need to be protected. And there are also a lot of capabilities that are being put in space that are meant to break us, and getting at our terrestrial component by getting at our space component. So yes, the idea of space warfare is a very real thing. We talk about it much more openly than we used to. And even at the White House, they've been realizing that that this is somewhat of an inevitability, and so we just need to address that warfighting in space is every bit as important as warfighting terrestrial. It's just a different domain.
So, I mean, the second part of that question was, how does modeling and simulation fit into a space warfare construct, right? And I think that question is almost inherent in, where you see any domain that has conflict, their modeling and simulation has played a role, right? Whether that is to try and understand how the effects of decisions on a campaign level, or whether it's a very micro level, what is the modeling and simulation I need to do to be able to present a realistic training to my operators, right? I think you're going to continue to see a growing role for mod and simulation within space warfare, specifically as Guardians have to get ready to experience what conflict is going to look like, right? And we are not going to likely train for that on orbit to the max extent possible, right? And so that is a huge role for modeling and simulation to try and understand, hey, how can we make that feel realistic? How can we have Guardians get the reps and sets that they need to be able to bring the fight or respond to it, whatever the situation may be.
And to pull the thread on mod and sim's role is there hasn't been a space war yet. Like, we don't have hundreds of years of history to draw upon to develop TTPs and see how things go. So everything we're looking at is kind of notional at this point. We are learning a lot of things from the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how jamming is playing a role there, and how we can use GPS to identify targets and things like that. So we're able to work that into our models and kind of keep it cutting edge to learn how we might employ space in the future. But really, it hasn't been done yet, so we got to practice in the mod and sim realm before we actually go live.
So I'm going to kind of combine these two questions together, and they're focused on the live, virtual, constructive, synthetic environment theme. And the question was directed actually to you, Colonel Peoples, but I will allow anybody to answer. And the first part of it was, what efforts and RFIs have you pursued to get that limited but scalable backbone for LVC? And then another related is, do you envision a singular synthetic environment across all 4 ranges, or multiple synthetic environments integrated to work collaboratively? I'm actually gonna field this a little bit first and then turn it over to you, because I come from the test community, and while we can use test for training, it's very different. The amount of data and the types of data that we're collecting during test are answering different questions than training is. And so it's never going to be all one. And I know that the price tag is sometimes attractive because you're like, well, we'll buy this for test and then we can use it for training. But it's very, very different, and it's not going to work the same. And so we need something different for training than for test. And as much as they try to push the training system or the training models and simulations on us for test, it doesn't really work for me to answer the questions I need to answer in that. So now I'll turn it over to you guys from the not test perspective.
Well, I would say, inherent in my job title is digital test and training, right? And so I think that is a recognition that these are separate areas that we need to address. Like I said, Major General Sheba has approved a dual path approach. We're going to have at least 2, if not more, synthetic environments for the purposes of training and for test, right? Because the architectures are different, right? The needs are different. And I think that trying to say that we're going to have one solution is not generally an architecture road that you want to go down, right? I think it's smarter to look at the capabilities that you need and apply them to what you're buying. In terms of RFIs and acquisitions, what I can tell you is that the OTTI PEO, Colonel Klopstein, is instituting a series of quarterly engagements with industry. All right, so we are going to be using a variety of methods to include commercial solutions openings, broad agency announcements, spec OTA, and other contract vehicles to really try and both get our message out to industry and see what great capabilities industry has that could serve the OTTI mission of getting our Guardians ready for combat, and also to use those pathways to be able to open to potentially non-traditional vendors as well, some of the amazing technologies like what we've seen on the floor here today.
Does anyone have anything to add? We can go to, there's an interesting one here, and I'll let you guys field this, but they want to understand the Space Force area of responsibility, and they mentioned satellite assets for communications, I'm guessing ISR and ops, launch vehicles, cyber, and other. And I would say, if I were to answer this, I'd say yes, all that is under the area of responsibility of space, but I'll let you guys expand on that.
So it kind of gets back to what's the difference between the Space Force and Space Command. And every time I go home for Thanksgiving, I got to try to explain this, right? So the Space Force has service responsibilities, train, equip. Space Command is a combatant command. So we are both a global and a regional combatant command, whereas like we have an AOR, it's space. It goes on forever, it's huge. But we also support everything terrestrially, so inherently everything we do is gonna have two parts to it, and it's gonna involve some other COCOM who has a geographic responsibility. All our ground stations are on somebody else's turf. And all their operations rely on our turf. And I forgot some of the other parts of the question, but there is a distinction to be made between the service and the command. And I'm just harping on that a little bit.
They essentially were listing satellite assets, launch vehicles, cyber, and other. And I say yes because within my test organization, we test all of these sort of things with the Space Force hat on. But yeah, they were asking what the area of responsibility is.
Those are all being done in terms of R&D as well, every one of those areas.
So this question I can answer for you. It says, when is the Space Force, the USSF, going to stand up a modeling and simulation office similar to the Army and Air Force to allow for space M&S development and integration? Well, I will tell you this, the DAF M&S environment serves the Space Force as well, and their use cases they took in Space Force use cases in it. So I would say the answer to this is it's already stood up, unless anybody wants to add anything else to that. So, and then the last question we have here is, connection has been a challenge, but not technical connection, more administrative, meaning MOUs, MOAs, ATOs. We have had a problem getting joint and coalition systems and networks linked based on these challenges. Believe we need an overarching authority to make these connections, OSD or DoD. How can the Space Force help move this to reality to support the live virtual constructive and M&S for training? I'm going to answer from the test perspective. I know that we're standing, DOT&E, that's the Department of the DoD Organization for Operational Tests and Evaluation. We are going to be part of a working group to talk about a central repository for data and how do we, because there's been forever in the DoD instruction for testing that you're supposed to have a common test and evaluation database. And so I've seen it done really well and I've seen it done really poorly. but a lot of people just hand wave it because we just don't have that connectivity between the manufacturer of our systems and then getting the test data, because people get nervous when the manufacturer is able to see what's going on behind the test curtain. So this is, as we go forward to the future, this has been my charge, and I've been crusading on this like I was crusading. I started this crusade for saving data and tagging it back in 2017 when I worked at the Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Center. And I didn't win then, but hopefully now people understand the importance of data and creating these data lakes and turning them into warehouses, because I'm certain that our adversary is doing it. So I feel like we're lagging a little bit, and we need to start thinking about creating these warehouses for the future, whether it's for machine learning and artificial intelligence uses, or just looking back at the history and trying to get a better picture of what we've done in the past to help us see the future. So that's my answer to that for the test perspective, and now I'll toss it over to you all for your perspective.
Well, I would say from the service perspective, right, I think one of the key foundational reasons why the Chief of Space Operations stood up OTTI as a concept and as a single PEO, Colonel Klopstein, was to try and solve, at least at the service level, some of those exact problems that you're talking about, right? How do we consolidate some of the infrastructure, not consolidate it physically, but consolidate the authority for acquisitions and for who the requirements authorities are, for this sort of amorphous group of stuff that used to be individualized training devices, individualized ranges, and infrastructure wherever we would find it, right? And so I think that from a service perspective, that is why one of the key foundational reasons OTTI has come together. I think the other part of that question is, how does the service help the broader DoD, is providing that demand signal up to OSD. I believe that, actually you can go visit them on the booth on the floor, Joint Staff J7, right, has working groups that we are actively involved in, both for modeling and simulation model formats, as well as network needs and infrastructure needs, connectivity, networks, data storage, right, because that is a huge gap, right? How do we get reciprocity of ATOs? How do we have common data formats, and how do we have standards for data transfer, be that cross-domain or within a domain, right? So I think that that's the proper avenue for us, at least from a test and training perspective now, and that's something we're actively working.
So some of my trigger words were in that question. I've spent the last couple years of my life worrying about ATOs and MOUs and these kinds of things, more so trying to get this lab stood up rather than conducting actual modeling. So what Space Command's doing, Mr. Yu, our J6, is an AO at this point. He's an authorizing official. And he's been given authorization to start a pilot for something we're calling JCS, a Joint Communication System. And it's going to be a Spacecom network. And it's starting off in our lab. So right now we have a standalone TS network where we do most of our MonSim, especially with tools that's not approved on a network. And we're running into a lot of problems trying to get data from an approved network onto a tool that's not necessarily approved. And there's these huge barriers to success that way. And we're hoping that by the time we stand up this JCS, get through the pilot and have it approved, and get an ATO to field this network, that we're able to better integrate with these commercial industry tools and data sources that can help us have better models and more robust models, and maybe overcome some of those hurdles that so many people are frustrated with the ATO process and other similar processes.
That's all. I don't have any other questions, so I will turn it over to you.
Thank you all for participating. This is very good.
And we can field questions after, till the end of our allotted time, if you were too afraid to put it on a card and have it read in front of the audience. So thank you for coming. And thank you, Sandra.